Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on with you all this morning. Thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about cyber threats. Next slide, Lori. I am Brian Polito. Started a small technical consulting business back in 1996. Hard to believe 25 years have gone by. Here we are, 2021. Our passion from the beginning is business technology. And what that distills down to is business process simplification, enhancement, and automation. We love making technology make a difference in people's lives. Everyone from a single individual in their place in this world to large organizations developing software applications, voice over IP phone systems, and of course, security. There's about 50 of us in our team of teams. In Cranes recently, there's a list that was given of the IT service firms in the area, and we're listed there with 34 engineers and IT folks serving our community. We're from Wadsworth, and we love serving. Security's on all of our mind. It's a very, very important topic these days. And so as we go through this presentation, please type in the chat any questions that you have. There should be ample time at the end of the presentation to address some questions. And then certainly we'll try to get back to people who have questions that we can't address in the presentation here. So introducing Daniel. Daniel is one of our partners. We, within our team, recognize that we can't know everything. And so we have, from the beginning, developed strong partnerships with many, many people and firms across the world, really. Daniel happens to be a local Northeast Ohio team member of Sophos, one of our partners, and has an extensive background in information security. And so I'll let him give his overview, and I want to introduce to you all. Daniel, please take it away.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. As Brian was mentioning, I am local. I live in Shaker Heights, Ohio, so not too far away from everyone here. You know, my background is obviously in information security technology. I started off in 2008, back when networks were still a thing of, kind of the old style of, token rings and IPX networks and things like that. And so, that's where I started my realm of knowledge. And obviously, a lot has changed in those 20 years or so, or 15 years or so of technology. So the purpose of today's call and the purpose of today's messaging is to not necessarily, drive fear into your organization about the threats that exist, but mostly to warn you about what we're seeing, some cautionary tales of what people have done, to help facilitate kind of breaches in their network, as well as to kind of outline what new technologies exist. Some of this stuff might be like, I didn't know you guys could do that, or I didn't know that technology like that even existed, or that solutions like that even existed. So that's the purpose of today's kind of presentation today and the agenda that we have set forth. So Laura, if you want to go to the next slide and kind of play this. This is our gut check slide, right? A lot of people go, well, we're not a target. We're not, threats aren't really real. We don't see it in the news as much as, we see it. And when we do see it in the news, of course, it's always the big companies, right? The big companies that are getting hit, right? And so, just wanted to show this as an example of, a 10-second, piece of time, and look at all the attacks that happen in just 10 seconds. And now this is around the world, but you see all the red dots here in America of areas within the US that are getting hit, right? So just to kind of outline, the threat is real. Malware, it does exist. Threat actors are out there specifically targeting organizations like yourselves. And the next couple slides are going to outline, some of the things that they're doing and how they're doing it. So go on to the next slide, Lori. Thank you. And I guess, we'll start with this, right? So ransomware is the biggest one, right? The biggest thing that I can put across to you about ransomware is it's what we call the end game of the current preferred end game of threat actor groups out there, right? And so if you're not educated on what ransomware is, the very basic definition of ransomware is it's encryption of files and or systems. Okay, and what that means is they take your system or a subset of files within your system, and they lock you out of it, right? And so they use an encryption software, or they use an encryption methodology to lock you out of those files, and they have the encryption key. So they locked your stuff, and then they have the key to it. And so there are two forms of that, right? The more common form of this ransomware nowadays that we're seeing is the file-based encryption. And that was because the older way that people used to get hit with ransomware was the whole system, right? They would get a big blue screen on their system and say, you've been hit with ransomware, contact us to get the key, right? And of course, that's where the ransom came into play. You would have to pay for that key, and then they would give you the key and you would unlock your system. Problem that a lot of threat actors found in that system-based compromise was, first of all, their keys weren't working, right? So they had technical issues with actually being able to unlock people's systems. And second of all, when people were locked out of their system, they just re-imaged their whole system and effectively neutralized the ransomware. And so what threat actors kind of evolved from that to say, well, we don't care what we lock out as long as it's important enough that the victim wants to pay for it. And so that's why what we're seeing nowadays is the more common form of ransomware is what we call file-based ransomware, where they'll actually get into your network, find out what's important to you as an organization, okay, and lock you out of that, whether that be a specific server in your environment or a specific system in your environment, or whether that's specific files within your environment, right? And so that's the current end game of threat actors right now that are, what we call the financially motivated threat actors, right? And so in the news, you'll hear stories about Russia this or China that or all that stuff like that. That's what we call nation state threat actors, and those are typically involved in cyber espionage and those type of actions. Specifically, the thing that we're talking about that's more relevant to you as businesses are what we call financially motivated threat actors. So these are, for lack of a better term, like the new age, mob, the new age mafia groups, right? And so these are organized groups of individuals that sometimes communicate across long distances, just like we're communicating today via Zoom, right? So they might be dispersed across the US, they might be dispersed across Europe, and they just centralized their operations, they centralize their location, and work remotely to infect people, to infect organizations through their various methodologies and practices. The end game for them currently is ransomware. Well, we're also starting to see a little bit more of these, because now become more file-based of the ransomware. They're actually extracting those files before they lock them. So they're doing what we call a double whammy, right? They're exfiltrating the data, meaning they're taking a copy of your precious data, and they're locking the copy that still exists on your systems, and then they're charging a ransom to unlock that data, and then they're charging a protection fee to store your copy of that data in their private cloud, right? And that's the way. It's very, very kind of kitschy the way they kind of market themselves to customers. They call them customers, but really what this is this a crime unit going after victims, right? And just to explain a little bit further about ransomware, there's many different variants or families of these ransomwares, and a lot of times they're named after the organization that's developing them, right? And so you'll have like names like Conti or Dark Ray or whatever, right? And those names will constantly change, because what happens is the organization, the group that's behind it that has to set up the infrastructure to support the ransomware, well, they'll retool every couple years, right? As they get more savvy and more successful in these businesses, they're also garnering the attention of the FBI, of Interpol, of all these organizations. So they're forced to kind of do their operation for 3 or 4 months, make as much money as they can, then go into hiding for 3 or 4 months. And then they come out as a new group, right? That's just basically reusing the same stuff that they used before, but with different names, right? And so they'll constantly repeat this. So you'll see a very cyclical action of ransomware groups, and some might be the flavor of the month, and next month it'll be somebody else. So just know that there's many different families and there's many different groups out there. We're tracking about 60 different groups that we can actually attribute to actually being organized groups of financially motivated threat actors that are doing these types of attacks on a regular basis. And again, they cycle in and out. But in general, they're all doing the same type of thing, right? And what I mean by that is they're all following the same methodology, right? This methodology is usually some way of getting on your systems. Usually that's through an email, or some more sophisticated ones are actually branching out and going into like direct messaging platforms like Snapchat, Facebook, LinkedIn, right? So we'll start though with some kind of indirect communication, right? Again, 90% of this is still through email. From there, they're able to get, you click a link or click a, fill out a form or download an attachment, and that's how they get into the system. That what they call the patient, what we call in the response realm, we call that the patient zero, right? That's the account compromise. And from there, the threat actor is going to work through your environment to try to escalate from whoever they compromised to maybe an admin within your organization. And then eventually that leads to that end game, right? The important thing to note about all this is that doesn't happen instantaneously. That usually happens in the course of days, weeks, even months. So when we do a response, and unfortunately, I've been on a lot of these response calls, we find that the victim actually has been compromised for weeks and or months at a time, and the actor has been just operating very low and slow in their environment and taking their time so that they don't get detected and so that they can get to their established objective, as whenever they want. The last point I'm going to make about this, and this is appropriate to you guys, is what we categorize as SMB, right? This, to us, SMB is anything under 500 users, right? But especially any organizations under 100 users are really a sweet spot right now for these threat actor groups, because you are basically, you're big enough to have the money to pay to save your business. So if you're looking at a choice of, my critical systems are down and I have to pay X amount to get my systems back and to keep my business running, threat actors are very astute and they're very aware of, how much, they can charge certain organizations and get away with it. So like they might say, hey, for $450, we'll unlock your systems for you. And you might think, well, that's a great deal, right? I'll pay that instead of having to go through all the challenges and trials and tribulations of trying to do remediation on my own. The problem is a lot of times, they'll charge you that and then they'll come back a month later and do it again and charge you again. And it becomes a recurring theme, right? And then now coupled with exfiltration of data, they might be charging you a monthly fee to keep you and hold your data now. So we always recommend never to pay the ransom, but just know, you're big enough to have money to pay the ransom, but you're small enough to not necessarily invest in all of the protections to stop these threat actors. Okay, and that's why you're a sweet spot right now. So go on to the next slide, Lori. Thank you so much. So this is a threat that hits all verticals. This is what I call an ubiquitous threat, right? We did a survey in early of this year. So in January and February of this year, we surveyed 5,400 IT managers across the globe. So in about 30 different countries, we contracted an independent research house called Vance & Bourne to do this survey for us. And basically what we did is we asked a couple questions, right? So, we asked, and we'll see some of those in the next slide, the questions we asked and what was answered, right? But as far as the respondents that responded back and said, yes, in the last year, we were hit by ransomware, we had a high amount of respondents that, actually this kind of surprised us with how many organizations said that, yes, we've been hit. So out of the 5,400, people that we surveyed, over half, roughly, about half of them said, hey, we've been hit with ransomware in the last year. And you can see that we broke it down by vertical, and you can see the counts here by each vertical, but retail all the way down to transport and distribution. So these are trucking companies in the transport and distribution side. In the retail side, it's your mom and pop stores and your retail all the way up to retail chains and franchises, right? So it does hit across all types of verticals. No vertical is immune. That's the point I wanted to make with this slide. So on to the next one. We'll talk about specifically for the US, how prevalent was it in the US? And so based on the survey, which again, the overall survey was worldwide, but we had breakouts by United States and other countries. Over half of the respondents said that they were attacked by ransomware in the last year. Now, whether those attacks were successful or not were a different thing, but they were at least attacked by ransomware. So the question was, were you attacked by ransomware in the last year? Of those 51%, just coincidentally, another 51% of them said yes, and the criminals were successful in encrypting data. And so half of half is roughly about 25% of all our respondents were actually got to the end game of this challenge here. The average cost for these organizations, and again, these are organizations that are very high as well as very low. About 50% of our organizations were SMB. So like I said, 500 seats and below. Half of the organizations were in that more mid-market enterprise organization. So the average of all of that was about $2 million for a single ransomware recovery cost. That included bringing in an incident response firm in. That included, recovering data. It included notifications. Sometimes there were some regulatory penalties for organizations that had regulatory requirements to keep data private. Some of this was the loss of goodwill and customer, goodwill and the loss of business, right? Just the fact that we were down for a week while we got our systems back up and running. So there is definitely a cost to it. Some of it's hidden costs, some of it's real costs. And then the other questions are just about, where we think people are going in the future. So, 77% of the organizations, so way more than what actually got hit, are looking at an increased workload of cybersecurity. So more alerts, more data that's coming in, more attempts at trying to get into their networks than before. 68% saw, an increase in actual attacks. 54% say that they are now too advanced, right, to handle it just with their own IT team. And then a lot of organizations, they have one person handling all of their IT, right? Some don't have any IT staff. So a lot of the organizations are looking at either increasing their IT security staff by 2023 or outsourcing or doing both. So let's go to the next slide because I want to talk about a couple lessons learned, right? So I like to talk about this and again, this is a cautionary tale for everybody here, but I want to look at some local examples using real life examples of attacks that unfortunately I've been, brought in and had to discuss and had to help our customers remediate. So this is in the last 8 months. So just so you know, this is hot off the presses, so to speak. Okay, and I'm not going to mention any names here because we're all local, and I don't want to call anybody out here. These are common mistakes that we've seen that could have potential dire consequences, and anyone can make these mistakes. Any organization could be a victim to one of these types of an attacks. So what are some of the lessons learned from all this, right? So in the first one, we actually had somebody that was reusing an account password and they were using their Facebook password, for lack of a better way to put it, as the same account password that they were using for a command and control console for their antivirus, right? So their management console for antivirus was the same password and account as their Facebook account. Unfortunately, the threat actors were able to guess this, right? Because they were able to take a list of accounts from a Facebook breach or something like that. And a lot of times people ask me, well, should I be worried? Because, I see these stuff in the news about LinkedIn had a data breach and Facebook had a data breach and all that stuff like that. Should I be worried? And my answer generally is no, unless you're reusing those accounts somewhere else, right? And then this happened to be the case, right? And so they were able to get into the console, disable their antivirus, and then launch ransomware on their systems from there, right? So very sophisticated type of attack that went, went into the whole, the whole need for making sure that your accounts are secure. So the lesson learned here is, if you have an opportunity to, if you have administrative accounts, use multi-factor authentication. So use a second form of authentication. Usually use a passcode or a one-time passcode, or an authenticator app that randomizes a passcode to log into things, right? That way you verify that the person that's logging in is an actual human being, number one, and number two, they're who they say they are, okay? The other big lesson here learned is, don't reuse accounts, right? Don't reuse account passwords. Use a password manager if you can, and have long and strong passwords for all accounts, not ones that can be easily guessed or easily spoofed. The second kind of lesson learned was, we had an unpatched and unprotected system. So this is a system that was actually not protected by our software, in an environment, and this led to that system being compromised, and that system being compromised led to a spread throughout their environment to a wider data breach, right? And so I unfortunately often have conversations with organizations, and I ask them a simple question: are all your systems being protected? And sometimes they say, well, we don't cover that server there, we don't cover this machine there, because it's only used for one thing, we don't need to protect it. Well, unfortunately, those types of examples are reasons why you really should have all your systems under protection at all times. This was very popular. This happened back in April, the third point, when tax season rolls around once a year, right? And when tax season rolls around, we see an uptick every year on phishing emails, trying to either impersonate somebody at an organization that has, accounting capabilities, or trying to target those accountant type people within an organization, with the purpose of, through social engineering, through these types of attacks, trying to gain access to that valuable W-2 data, right? That tax data that they can then use for the purposes of long-term, things like, identity theft and other things like that. So unfortunately, we saw an uptick of that again this year. This goes to one of the points I'm going to have in my next slide, which is, train your users to spot phishing attacks, especially ones that would impersonate management. Always treat, requests like this, anything that's financially motivated, any type of request like that, always treat it with a grain of salt as an individual. It takes 2 seconds to pick up the phone and call the person that sent you that email, just to verify that they actually sent it, right? And that can lead to a lot less headaches down the line. And then on the last one, is just a cautionary tale that next gen doesn't always mean next gen, right? And what I mean by that is, unfortunately, I was brought in on a case where, a client of ours had an older version of a software package of ours that, at the time, this is 6-7 years ago, was considered next gen antivirus, right? And they had never really updated that skill set. They had really never updated that endpoint software over the course of those 5-6 years to really meet the needs of modern day threats. And unfortunately, due to that, they thought they had next gen protection, but that next gen was the old gen basically, and it wasn't good enough to stop a particular type of attack. The threat actor was able to get a foothold in their environment and able to launch ransomware from that. So if anything else, evaluate your endpoint security, evaluate your whole security portfolio. If it's older than 4 or 5 years, as far as technology goes, it's a great, great opportunity for you to try to refresh your knowledge and refresh your capabilities for preventing attacks. And that's going into my last point, my last slide, and Lori, if you'd be so kind to go to that. What are some of the current gen, quote unquote, right? What are the current technologies that you may or may not be aware of that are out there to protect you from this stuff? So here are the current trends in cybersecurity, right? And so on the email side, I still think email is the #1 vector for malicious attacks. It's the number one way that organizations are being breached. It always traces back to an email. So, we talk about bang for our buck, and if we could only spend our IT security spend, where would I spend it? And I would say one of two places, right? Email and endpoint, because email is where they always try to launch their attacks from. Endpoint is where they always try to land, right? And so, talk about where do we want to spend our spend. In upgrading our environment, those are the two biggest things. Obviously, network is important as well. But again, we have limited funds in a lot of organizations. So bang for the buck. Email, right? A lot of the stuff nowadays is focused around avoiding what we call BEC attacks, or business email compromise attacks. So a lot of the new technology in email is all about detecting like somebody trying to spoof an email address, right? And trying to trick you into clicking on something in an email. And there's also a lot of new technology around how do we test our users to avoid, so that we can actually launch our own kind of spoofing attack against our own users and train them on the proper, looking at links and making sure that things are safe before we go forward with it. Or, hey, verifying that user that just sent me an email asking for all my W-2s, is that actually the CEO, or was it somebody trying to impersonate the CEO, right? On the endpoint side, the new bare minimum is anti-exploit behavior. So let's get antivirus out of our heads, guys, and no longer talk about antivirus, anti-malware, and start talking and thinking about anti-exploit, because that is what threat actors are doing nowadays. They're taking advantage of vulnerabilities that exist in software, whether they be patched or unpatched, and they're leveraging exploits for those vulnerabilities to gain access to a system where they didn't have access before. And so the only defense against that is anti-exploit technology, right? These are not, viruses, these are not malware. These are, just pieces of code used and embedded in things to take advantage of vulnerabilities in software. And so the bare minimum nowadays on a endpoint solution should be this anti-exploit technology to recognize when somebody's trying to do something behaviorally on a system that does not mesh with like what that system should be doing. Taking that next step further, and this is something down the line that you might want to look at as you look at your organization and your overall cybersecurity stack and your maturity, right? How do I get more mature as to proactively blocking threats in my attacks, right, or attacks in my environment? How do I stop those guys from getting a foothold, and then once they have a foothold, doing all those things I talked about before, like escalating privileges and trying to spread laterally in my environment, right? And all about that. That's all about these new set of tools that you might hear about. If you're hearing about it now for the first time, right? Is EDR, right? Endpoint detection and response, right? On the endpoint side, this is all about getting visibility into the behavior of your machine, helping you understand what's suspicious activity, right, on your environment. Same thing goes on the network side. We have a lot of encrypted traffic now, right? Every site that you go to nowadays should be an HTTPS site. That's a good and a bad thing, right? A good thing in that we know that the sites that we're going to are encrypted. A bad thing in that threat actors are using encryption too against us. They're doing it for the purposes of, hey, if I can encrypt my network traffic while I'm on your network, then I can basically operate unimpeded because you don't see that. You can't get visibility into the encrypted traffic. And so we're seeing threat actors using this SSL technology or this encryption technology for network traffic to kind of hide their tracks. So having a network appliance that can break that chain and break that encryption and inspect that traffic is important as well. And then finally, a lot of organizations go, hey, we would love to have that visibility. We would love to have that proactive type of monitoring in our environment, but we don't have the manpower to do it. And that goes back to my previous slide where a lot of organizations are looking at augmenting their existing IT staff from a security perspective by outsourcing it and having human researchers and responders respond to that. And so the basic thing I put here is that, hey, the attackers are human beings, right? And so because they're human beings, AI and machine learning and all that stuff like that on the protection side, it can only get you so far. You have to have, if you're interested in the best protection available, you have to have another human being at the other end playing defense. And so that's where the overall market is going. for the endpoint detection and response capabilities is having an actual team that can help you respond. And so with that, those are the trends in cybersecurity. I'll hand it back over to you, Brian, let you take it away from there, and open to having any conversations in the future. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. A lot of good information, certainly an overview. Within a 30, 45-minute presentation, it's impossible to hit specific details. And of course, we're not trying to promote a certain vendor's tool sets. We're trying to just educate in a broad sense, and hopefully we've achieved that. I'm unable to see the questions and answers that are going on here that might be showing up in the chat. Lori, are you able to see those and maybe read them off? And Daniel, feel free to jump in. I'll jump in too, and if there are any questions that we can answer.
So at this time, I am not seeing any questions in the chat. So I encourage you to enter those in now. What are things that they're thinking about? What are some things that Daniel mentioned that maybe you've experienced, or you'd like to share an experience that happened at your business? I believe that last month I shared that the Orrville Area Chamber had a phishing attack happen with one of our staff members' emails that she had clicked on something that she shouldn't have, and it sent emails out to everyone in her address book. We had to scramble a bit to get that secured, and we hope that we did what we needed to do to fix that. I'm sure that there are others that have had some incidents as well, or just anything that you're thinking about. There's a variety of different industries that are represented here today. We've got 30 different people on the call, so just type your response into the chat box, and well, you have an expert on the line that can respond to you.
While we're waiting, I have a couple of things, just anecdotal stories. Daniel told a few. We have many, and some of them are quite unusual. So while we're waiting for a few chats there, one of them was an email was spoofed from a grandchild to a grandparent who was at work. The grandparent got the email, and it was very urgent plea, and that person, in their attempt to respond to the email, actually had an accident at work with a tow motor. And so this can extend a little bit beyond what we often think about. And it was a pretty bad accident. And so you all know about how those types of things go, but it was actually a complete spoof. Another customer, a grandparent, received an urgent phone call from their supposed grandchild that said, "I need you to go to the bank and get me this money right away and send it to this bank account." Of course, the grandparent was very concerned, went to the bank, but on the way at the bank, they wrote a note to the teller to please call the police for me. So the police arrived very rapidly at the bank and were able to tap the line and track down where this phone call came from. Thankfully, it was not a grandchild in distress, because this grandchild was crying and screaming and was very, very, very emotionally charged. So some of these types of attacks we're not really thinking about when we think of the attacks into our systems. I bring these up because how did the bad guy get the email address of the grandparent? How did the bad guy get the cell phone number of the grandpa in that case? It was all through data breaches that this information becomes available. And so there's a much more far-reaching effect to the attack surfaces and the data that's getting attacked than just your computer is locked out for 3 days, or you lose some of your data to some attacker. So I just thought I would share some of that, because we don't always think about the chain that occurs. And of course, we all know that this data is being kept in a database. So this email address of this grandma running the tow motor is, or was it a grandpa? I think it was a grandma, actually. I might have said grandpa earlier. That email address is still in the bad guy's database now, and it can be used again. So there's just a variety of things that we can think about and develop our education and our approaches.
Yeah,
We
and
have
that's
a couple questions now.
Great.
So the first one's from Hope Murr. If you have a remote connection like Citrix, is it easier for them to attack that remote connection?
Yeah, that's a great question. Citrix is actually a little bit more secure than I would say your average remote connection software would be. So there's RDP, right? There's Citrix, there's terminal services, there's a number of different solutions of getting remote access to your applications. There's always that balance of convenience factor for the user, right? Especially as we work from home, right? Versus the security of opening up holes in our environment. So the answer is it easier for an attack against that remote connection? Relative to not having that connection at all, yes, right? But relative to other technologies, no, because Citrix is a secure protocol. So speaking specifically of Citrix, and I'm very familiar with the Citrix protocol, Citrix is a secure protocol that's usually encrypted. So you're probably setting up an access gateway or some type of a secure remote access connection in, and then leveraging the Citrix portfolio. That might be a little bit more hidden for the user than a little bit more obfuscated for the user. But know that Citrix is generally more secure than other remote access solutions. But any opening in your firewall is a potential threat, right? And so it's a matter of monitoring that, making sure that that usage is what people say that is, right? The biggest threat on the Citrix side is somebody getting access to that individual's Citrix credentials, right? So that they'll log in and access those apps on their behalf. Just as I mentioned before, my example of the account compromise, so password reuse. So if somebody's using Citrix, make sure that they're using some form of multi-factor authentication, or they're using some really long and strong unique password for that connection, and that's the best way you can secure that kind of in a easy way.
Yep. So there's two generic ways of using Citrix. One is for remote desktop, and one is for remotely published applications. Mm-hmm. And so immediately, the published applications are more secure than the access to the desktop. Correct. And the reason is very simple. If they do get access to your credentials, getting access into that remote desktop is much more damaging than just getting access to a few applications. But it does boil down to exactly what Daniel just mentioned. It's all about your passwords and your usernames and keeping those things secure, because that port is wide open for me as an attacker to try to hit with a Citrix client and guess your passwords. And so not only do you need to make sure that you're using your usernames and passwords are appropriate, you also need to be looking at the log files, and you need to have alerts on the log files of how many missed passwords did you have today, or in the last 10 minutes or the last hour, because those brute force attempts of trying to beat their way in using lists of passwords that they might have accumulated in their database of passwords about you, that could be a way they can compromise. In addition, there are some other ways, which would be to get you an email to come in and say, hey, this is your Citrix support desk. We need you to reset your password, click here. And of course, then they're going to take that information and possibly run with it. Of course, they're going to say, in order to change your password, you got to put in your current password and then put in the change password. And then the screen will come up and say success, except the success is ultimately only for them. Now they can get in as you, and the damage is happening. And of course, you as a user are not likely to report this to your superiors because you're afraid that maybe you did something wrong. So let's just hope that nothing bad happens. And of course, that's also a very bad thing to do.
Okay, we do have one more question from Nina Miller. And sorry, my screen got a little funny here. Okay, we received an email supposedly from the boss asking payroll to change his bank account immediately for deposit of his paycheck. Funny, the email address looked legit until you looked really close. So what are your responses to that?
Yeah. That's a typical what we call business email compromise type of attack, right? Where they try to spoof the address, and they'll use actually special characters. So there's like a special character. It's like a Greek word, like a Greek characters and things like that that will look just like a regular English character. And they'll use that instead of a G, it'll be like the Greek word for gamma, right? And it'll be like it'll look just like a G. And so they'll do that, and they'll put that in the GOV, right? So they'll send you an email from cdc.gov talking about the new mask mandate or something like that, right? And you'll think it's coming from the cdc.gov, but it's really coming from cdc.Greek character OV, you know. And that's a common technique. We call it typo squatting, right? In other words, they're squatting on the email address. They're using a typo to kind of spoof that email address, and that's a very common form. So kudos to you for recognizing that as an attack, for sure.
Yeah, very, very important. And this is where when Daniel talked about training users and actually doing attacks from the inside. It's embarrassing when the owner of the company falls for it. I can tell you firsthand. Okay, so it's worth the embarrassment to send fake spoofing to your users on a very regular basis, weekly, monthly, because we need to all stay on our toes, and we need to all be examining, is this likely to be a spoof or not? And I have a personal thought. This is just my own thought. Industry doesn't necessarily say this, but I encourage everyone, never click on a link in an email. Word never is very strong. I sincerely mean it. Never open an attachment in an email. Never is a very strong word. And so here's how you get around this. You know, okay, you say, how do we do business now? You have to make a phone call to the sender, or maybe it's a text message to the sender using a third or an alternate communications path that is not likely to be known by the bad guys, to get to that person and say, did you just send me an email with this exact link in it or this exact attachment in it? At that point, then you can feel free to click through. But the word never stops us in our tracks, and it will prevent very, very large number of breaches.
Okay, one final question here would be, are there any additional security concerns with working from home?
Yeah, a lot. So, and a lot of this can be mitigated by having a good, secure remote access solution into your corporate resources, because that's really what the crux of this is how do I get my employees that want to work from home access to all the resources that they would normally have, if they were in the office, right? And so it's just like the Citrix conversation, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? We want to play that seesaw effect of providing access so that people can work versus how many holes do we open up in our security platform, right? And so, Citrix is a good example of a solution that helps you bridge that gap, right? VPN, right? Or secure remote access solutions are a great way to verify that the user that's logging in are who they say they are, right? And so once they've been verified, then they have access to their resources. And so it's always important to evaluate how are you giving people resources, right? And evaluate the security of that. Are we verifying and verifying the identity of these people that are logging into these resources? Are we verifying their access to the resources? Are we making sure that the people that are logging in, are we just giving them the keys to the whole kingdom, or are we only going to give them access to what they need to do their job? That's important too, because if an account is ever compromised, you minimize your risk by just giving them access to things that they need access to, and not giving them, as Brian was mentioning, an example of the whole desktop versus the apps, right? If you give them access to the whole desktop, well, great. Well, that means the threat actor now has access to the whole desktop. Give them access to just the apps that they need, right? This is a concept in security we call least privilege. Give them only access to things that they need. Don't give them access to anything else. If they require access to something else, they have to make a specific request, and you have to verify them. So, but yeah, this is definitely a concern of a lot of organizations, especially with this work from home. You know, even in post-COVID realm, a lot of organizations are kind of struggling with this and saying, well, how much do we want to allow people working from home? Right.
Yep, very good. So I appreciate that. And I'd like to add a few thoughts in addition there, Daniel. That was all really good. In general, you do not want a home user to access your data network with a home PC. That PC is not protected in the same way that their work PC is protected. And it's kind of a legal issue. You really can't necessarily force a home PC, a person's home computer, to be under your security policies and procedures. It's an interesting problem. So in general, you do not want your employees to use their home PC to access any of your business data. The other item that's really valuable here is home Wi-Fi networks are easy to compromise. And so if you're connecting your work PC to your home Wi-Fi network, there's also a fair amount of risk there. And so that is another aspect to be really careful about. The other one is about dealing with VPNs, virtual private networks. They've gone into wide use now, of course, and they are a very valuable tool. That tool, if it's put on a home PC that is compromised by a bad guy, now suddenly he has access, or she has access to the VPN. In addition to a VPN having a challenge is when a person is connected at home, this is a subtle, interesting little observation that we've made. They tend to not work in quite the same business mindset that they would if they were in the office. Meaning, they might cruise the internet or social media or other non-work related websites that have an additional risk factor. And since we don't have our protections at people's homes on their internet browsing like we do at the office, it's not being, you might just call it filtered. It's far more complex than that on these devices we put in place. But the traffic coming in could actually be very poisonous and going straight to the work PC that is vulnerable then, because the user is cruising to websites that they feel comfortable cruising to at home, and it can cause a lot of damage at that level as well. So those are just three things that come to my mind. There are actually many more. One of the things we've seen is the increase in theft of workstations and laptops. Because they're in people's homes, they disappear, and then all the data that's on them is now in somebody else's hands. That can be also very, very damaging and dangerous, depending on what the data is that's kept locally on that computer there, that's in an unprotected environment in someone's, living room or kitchen or den.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. Great insights today. Both Daniel and Brian, we're very glad to have you with us. I know I learned things, and I'm sure that all of our attendees did as well. We think that Eric White is available to join us to give his BWC update. So we're going to give it a try to get Eric on the line. And I'm going to pull up some slides that he'd like to share with you. So Eric, if you're there. All right, I think he is having weather issues, but I'm going to share the the slides that he has asked us to take a look at here. Oh, there's Eric. I see him now. So I'll let you take it away.
Can you hear me, Lori?
I can hear you. You're on.
All right, great, great, okay. Sorry guys, I don't know what's going on with my internet. We've had some storms down here, so I'll blame it on that. So Lori has the PowerPoint. I'm gonna let her do it on her side just in case I drop out again. So I'll just have her advance these slides as we go. I won't keep you very long, but she had asked me to talk briefly about 3 specific types of grants that the Bureau is offering currently right now. And you can see those on your screen in bold. Those are the Safety Intervention Grant. That grant's been around for many, many, many years. The Drug-Free Safety Program Grant, as well as the Workplace Wellness Grant. So I'm just gonna touch briefly on those 3. And then at the bottom there, you see the other BWC grants that are also available to you. You can find all the information on these grants on our website. But you see the body armor, that is for police, for them to buy body armor for their officers. The Developmental Disabilities Grant, that is to help folks that work directly with folks with disabilities to offer them services mostly in the training side. Firefighter exposure, that is equipment that firefighters can use to help with protection from cancer, from the fires that they fight. School and safety security is just that. It's monies available for schools to help with security at their campuses. And then the last one there is the trench safety grant, which gives employers monies to purchase protective systems while their employees are working inside of trenches. Okay. All right. So with that, if you want to go to the next slide there.
Yep.
The Safety Intervention Grant. Now, the next slide will show that that grant is currently on hold indefinitely. So I'm not really going to get into that, the specifics of that, but as a refresher, hopefully we don't know when, but they're holding those funds that we typically have, which is around the number of about 15 million annually to fund that grant. But because of COVID, they're putting that grant on hold. But that grant, when it does come back, hopefully that grant is available for employers that qualify to give them up to $40,000 to make a safety intervention in their workplace. So if you've got a process or procedure at your workplace that is causing injuries or likely to cause an injury because of repetitive motion or falls or whatever it might be, if there's a piece of equipment that you could implement, we're going to give you up to $40,000 to do that. And it's a 3-to-1 matching grant. Okay. So the next one here is the Drug-Free Safety Program Grant. So this one, as you can see on the screen, is a grant that funds to help create a workplace free of alcohol and other drugs. So in order to be eligible for this grant, you have to be already participating in the BWC's Drug-Free Safety Program. And basically what this does is this helps offset the cost of some of the details in implementing this plan. So if you go to the next slide, it will help you reimburse the rates like you see on the screen there, written drug-free safety policy programs. So up to $750 for you to get help from a third party to develop that program and have it legally in place. So up to $750. The rest of the rates or the reimbursement is for employee education and also for supervisor education. So for you folks that are in the drug-free safety program, you know, one of the requirements is that you have to do annual education for your employees as well as for your supervision. So the grant is designed to help offset some of those costs. And that's what the next few slides will show. I don't know if we want to go into all these specifically, but I've got information at the very end of this PowerPoint that you can give me a call. All this stuff is on our website, or you can call me directly and I will walk you through it. But as you can see, it's basically offsetting the cost of training of your supervisors and your employees and the specifics of that. Now, real quick, some of the unapproved purchases, it will not pay for in-house training staff. It does not pay for any third-party consortium fees. It doesn't pay for the testing itself. It also will not pay for the salaries or wages of your employees while they're sitting in and doing the training. And then you can look down there, duplication of written drug-free policies. If you have to redo it, it won't pay for things of that. Or education and training, such as room rentals, equipment rentals, food, of those sorts. Okay. How do you apply? Very, very simple. You just go to our website under the Drug-Free Safety Program Safety Grant page. There's a link here. So if Lori wants to send this out to everybody, if you click on that link, it'll take you right to the procedural guide that will explain everything in great detail. And then it will also have the application attached to that guide. Okay. But again, what's important here is you have to already be or getting ready to enroll into the BWC's Drug-Free Safety Program. Okay. All right. And the last one here, the Workplace Wellness Grant. This program provides funding for employers to establish training and programs to reduce health risk factors specific to their employees. So what's the eligibility requirements here? Basically that you don't already have an existing wellness program, okay? What is a wellness program? Basically, they define it as having annual biometric testing and a third party coming in to help you implement your wellness coaching, okay? So if you don't already have both of those in place, you are eligible for this grant. So if we go to the next slide, what this grant does is it allows you to basically, it funds the implementation of biometric screening and a third party to come in and do the coaching. Okay, so you can see on the screen there, once you're approved for the grant, you must contract with that third party wellness program vendor, and then you must agree to share aggregate data related to the employee's health risk factors to the BWC. Okay, and if you go to the next slide there, basically what it does is participating employees may receive $300 per participating employee over a 4-year period up to $15,000. And they break it out. You can see the first year you get $100, $75, $75, and then the fourth year $50, and up to $15,000. Okay. The next slide. So the grant fund can be used to compensate that third party program vendor, like we mentioned, provide the biometric screening, and then also the activities designed to address any health issues that come up as a result of that screening and assessments. And some examples, and these are just a few: weight loss management programs, educational seminars, and physical fitness activities and nutritional counseling. So all those things, that $300 per employee up to $15,000 total, those are what can be used for those funds. Now, next slide tells us how to apply. Again, I've got a link there for you. So basically, the employer must complete an online grant application. If you click on that link, it'll take you right to the Wellness Grant app, and then you'll see the other links that gets into all the details about what has to be submitted to the Bureau as far as that aggregate information that you saw earlier. Okay. I know that was a very quick, high overview, but those are the three that are out there. If you've got questions, if we've got time, Lori, I'll try to take them now, or there's my contact information. Feel free to give me a call, email me, and be more than glad to walk you through those or answer any specific questions you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. I'm glad that we were able to get you on. Is there any other information from the Bureau that you wanted to share with the group today?
Well, like always, we have, and I can try to share my screen, but we have all of our online classes that we're still offering because of the working from home status with COVID. We are still working from home. They are going to slowly roll us back out into the field. So if there's any of you folks in attendance, if you're wanting or need some on-site services from me, contact me, and I'll give you the scoop on how we can get back out into the field and work with you. So that is in place starting now. It's going to be a limited, but they are allowing us back out into the field on a limited basis. So give me a call. But like always, we still have all of our online training courses that we've always have. We've got our webinars. I'm sure Lori is sending those out as she gets them from us to all you guys. And then we also have the classes that you've normally come to our locations for. We're doing some of those online as well in abbreviated form. So with that is really about all I have.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Eric. We are a few minutes over, so I appreciate everybody hanging on with us to get this last information in. I will share the PowerPoint that we just went through very quickly with all the grant information that you saw. So we'll get that out to you, as well as the PowerPoint slides from Daniel's presentation, so you can have that for reference. We'll post the recording of the program, the webinar today, on the orrvillesafety.com site for our archive. So if you'd like to share this with others at your facility, or with friends that need to hear this information, I'm glad to find that on our website. So once again, I want to thank Brian Polito and Daniel for being with us today. And let me know if there are things that we can help to support you with. We'll watch for your emails from the Orrville Area Safety Council as we share out information as it comes to us. One final note is that the Wayne County Health Department has updated information about the COVID situation in Wayne County. As you know, there's a lot of variables going on right now, and some new things that we're all being required to take a look at once again. So do pay attention, go to that website frequently and see what the updated information is. That's a great resource for you. And then our September 8th webinar will be on the topic of injury, first report of injury, the OSHA first report of injury process, and that'll be presented by Scott Sinclair, the Regional Business Development Director from the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation. So I hope that you will join us for our program next month, and have a great day. So stay dry out there, and the raindrops are still coming down here.